Hello and welcome to the Broad Review. I'm Josh, and today we are on Challenge 4 of the 52-week movie challenge. Now, this one its category is a film starring animal or animals. Now, there was one of two potential ways I could have gone with interpreting this challenge of films starring animals. Either a film where the main characters or main character are animals, so in the kind of style of most animated films, or films starring literal animals that are then either dubbed over or interact with humans to give some kind of narrative, in the way that films like Beethoven and Babe are. I interpreted this challenge, given its wording, to be either of these, and I'm not very fond of the latter, so I went to the former. In this case, a film starring animated animals. This gave me quite a bit of a dilemma, because obviously there are lots of animated films out there, but also there are lots of animated films I've seen. And for anybody who has watched this, you'll know that my regular category is whatever comes up that week, but also the fact that I've never seen this film before. There will be a notable exception in the weeks to come, because one of the categories is your favourite film. I can't have a favourite film without having watched it. But aside from that, they all have to be films that I've not watched before. Now, that eliminated quite a lot of animated films, partly because of my youth, and I watched quite a lot of them growing up, because when I was 10 years old and starting to transition out of some of those kind of films, my sister was born, which meant those films had a reawakening for another 10-12 years. And then when she was starting to grow out of it, my older sister had a niece, and now we're going through those films again. So, as good as since I've been born, so that's 1995, I've had a lot of animated films in that time, and obviously it's not just a case of animated films that were released, but also predate that. So it was finding a film that I hadn't seen before and starred animals. In this case, I went for a film that I was acutely aware of because of various TV programmes, but I'd never actually seen. And that's because it's a much more American cartoon than it is a British one. And when the name is An American Tail, that much is obvious. Now, I picked this film for two reasons, realistically. One is because I'm quite a big fan of sitcoms. And in various sitcoms like Community and like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, references to American Tail come up often enough that it means that there's some kind of significance to the film in an American cultural sense. And being British, I'd never really had any knowledge of it. I was aware that there was a film called American Tail, but nothing beyond that. So the 1986 film American Tail became the film for me. And when I was looking at kind of reviews for it, just to kind of see what I was letting myself in for, a lot of them were rather negative. In contrast to the kind of pop cultural representation it had, a lot of them calling it the darkest or the scariest or the most depressing children's story ever. So it was rather interesting to go from that perspective and try and find out what I wanted to get from this film and what I wanted to see, because obviously animated films, generally speaking, are either solely derived for children or have those children enjoyments with sort of inside jokes or elements that parents can get on board with to kind of hook that wider appeal. So when I started watching it, I thought, yeah, this is going to be dark. It started with the burning down of the Moscovich's village by cats who are very quickly become a very clear allegory for basically evil, because they take various forms during the film. Originally, I thought it was going to be somewhat of a propaganda-style piece. That's not good English, but a propaganda-style piece, because when you consider that it's 1986, towards the tail end of the Cold War, when you consider that it started with a lot of these cats burning down a village and clearly meant to be Bolsheviks, or more generally communists, I thought, oh, here we go again. But then throughout the film it becomes very obvious that the cats are very much an allegory for just evildoers, because we see them as fascists as well throughout the film. We see them as gangsters throughout the film. So it has those allegory there, and what struck me watching this was how very clearly this film wasn't written with children in mind. Now, American Tail is the story of essentially it's an immigrant's tale of coming to America, and it's a very clear, very distinct parallels between the real life adventure of immigrants coming to America, certainly during the height of the sort of immigration to the New World, and then the Moscovich's sort of anthropomorphic representations of that, and the hope and optimism that a new land is going to bring, and the fundamental lack of fulfillment of that promise. The most clear one is that there's no cats in America. Now, automatically as an audience member, you're drawn to that statement like a moth to a flame, because you know full well there are cats in America. This ain't gonna be whole sunshines and rainbows as we expect. And there's a real message there in terms of the immigrant story, that immigrants come to a country for hope and optimism. They come because they're looking for a better life, and this was a really vivid and really stark interpretation of the story to, generally speaking, say it ain't gonna be necessarily a good and easy life. It ain't gonna be a good time. You have the journey in which the Moscoviches believe that their son has died. The journey itself was hazardous. Foul conditions. We have xenophobia, when the Mouses come to America and ask to change their names to escape persecution. The fact that the conditions that they end up living in are cramped and overbought. The fact that nobody really cares that Vival's dead, outside of his family, but everybody else is very much the opinion, oh well, he died. And it's a really poignant story, and it's so poignant it had to be written for the adults. This story, as much as you might say it's there to educate, it's there to help children understand the struggles of an immigrant, it really has the smacking of almost shaming an adult audience for potential xenophobia, because it's just so viscerally there that it seemed, I have an idea, it seems so lucid and so inescapably a mark of the piece that it just had to be there as a lesson for the parents. Because I can't see many children going to watch this and going, oh, this is a fun family romp, because there are quite a lot of bleakness in it. Now, bleakness isn't bad from a film, but it has that almost inalienably saddening aspect that this has to be educational to all audience. This had to be something that all audience had to get, and there's a hell of a lot of respect that has to go to the filmmakers in respect to this film, because it so hammers home that message throughout. It would be very easy, and it's been done before, where people have little smatterings of message throughout but don't really follow through in the piece, or allow the piece to differentiate its message, or otherwise change its message throughout, and it gets a little bit confused and a little bit haphazard all over the place. This film doesn't do that. This film is very clear about its identity and very clear what it wanted to do. What I would say, because this is a semi-musical piece, is that most of the musicality isn't strong. There is, of course, one very obvious exception, which is Somewhere Out There, which is one of the most beautiful and harrowing songs from this film. Essentially, children singing about whether or not they're missed and whether or not they're loved. And there's a reason that this song has cemented itself in pop culture, because it is so bleak, but in such a heart-pulling, heart-rendering way. I would say the majority of the other songs don't live up to it, and there's a lot of forgettable tunes in this film. Now, the general story, because I know I've very much gone on about thematics and then the musicality, is that the Moscoviches are being persecuted by cats, and they decide to immigrate to America because they believe there's no cats in America. And it's about their journey and their struggle along the way. Now, Fievel, out of curiosity, ends up getting himself lost and the family believing he's dead. And then it's a story about how the family are trying to move on from Fievel's death, but how Fievel is trying to find his family. And he goes through general ups and downs on the road to find his family, and it has that sort of classic irony to the film, where there's moments where they constantly almost meeting or constantly just missing each other. And it's a good section of the film to have, and it's a really good narrative device, and you can tell where children were more focused on, and it's that idea that things were just out of sight and just, there's a sort of element of luck which slightly come at odds with some of the film's content, because the film very much has the stark realism, and so the idea of the accident, you just have to be lucky, it's a complicated message there. But aside from that, and essentially they almost meet quite a lot of times, Fievel then basically joins and helps a resistance of mouses trying to rid the world of cats, and it fundamentally ends with the family being reunited and a very round and warm, happy ending. Now, all in all, I've gone on for a good probably 10 minutes about the message and the visceral realism and the real world comparisons, and how I do believe that this film is fundamental, important viewing for all people. And I'm so pleased that this category and this challenge has given me the opportunity to watch this film, because otherwise it was a film that I probably wouldn't have watched. It's probably a film I'd always go, oh, that'd sound nice, and then never watched. So I've got to say, this is probably, for the first time during this process, is a film that I'm beyond privileged to have now watched. There's films I've watched that I've enjoyed, but I would certainly live my life having not enjoyed them, and I feel that there's a betterment to an experience like this, and I feel that this film does have a real heart and a real soul, and it does try to accomplish something. Now, the fact that we're sitting here 35 years later, and there's still a lot of prejudice against immigrants and refugees, tells us that the battle isn't yet won. I do apologise, my throat was getting a bit claggy there. But I think all in all, we need more filmmakers like the makers of American Tail wanting to achieve something, wanting to really get a message out there. Because I think, especially with animation, there's a lot of focus on detail. There's a lot of focus on quality. There's a lot of focus on story in terms of arc and extended narratives. but not massively on that sort of story element where that message really comes through properly. There are messages, of course, there are to animated films, but they're not quite as visceral, and they're not quite as out there, and they're not quite as hit you in the heart as An American Tail is. Now, that being said, I'm going on with this film, and you can tell I have a very high respect for it, but there are, from a purely filmmaking standpoint, a lot of inconsistencies and a lot of issues with this film. Now, this film's an hour and 20, so it's only 80 minutes long. Now, for me, I say that if you're going to make a film that's less than an hour and a half, so 90 minutes, you have to make sure that every second you are using counts. And I say the same for any film that goes over 3 hours. After 3 hours, you have got to make every second count, because you've got to justify why your film is so short or why your film is so long. Because 80 minutes is a short film. Very short, I think only Dumbo. Obviously there are other films, I think like 77 minutes, but Dumbo's often one of the shortest films at only 70 minutes. That's the original, not the remake, which they somehow made 2.5 times longer. But you've got to justify every second you are doing, and this film wastes time. There are lots of musical sequences with characters that we barely see again. We have the pigeon that Fievel meets closer to the beginning, who then plays no significance to any part in the plot beyond his little song sequence and pointing him in the right direction, only to then appear at the end to fly them all away. We have the good cat that Fievel meets and forms a powerful relationship to, and they sing a song together, only for that to then have no real relevance to the rest of the plot. We have the other mouse character from the sweatshop, who again, they sing, they dance, they have a relationship, and then realistically we don't see him again, or it has no relevance to the plot up until looking for Fievel right at the end. There's a lot of characters who have no real significance, who are planted, and then we see no real significance to them right up until the time the narrative demands it of them. Now this, to me, it wastes 3 basically song sequences, and that's time that we could have spent getting to know these characters. And when you're having an 80-minute film and you're packing it with songs, you're not leaving a lot of room for narrative growth. You're not leaving a lot of room to explore ideas, and that really showed, because when Fievel came to America, he got sent to a sort of fairground, sort of circus, market style place, where he meets a rat. Now this rat turns out to be a cat in disguise, but this rat sells him on to basically a sweatshop, a slaver. And we have the standard trepidation, we have the standard dread when he's then sent there. And in the very next scene he escapes, and we have no knowledge of the perils he went through during that sweatshop. We have no visual representation of the hard work he was doing. All we needed was a 20-second montage of him being exhausted, of him working to the bone, for him being forced into labour and then trying to escape. And it's only a montage. I'm not looking for anything that's going to scar children. I'm looking to tell us that motivation to leave. Now, as an adult, you obviously know what his motivation is, but we jump too narratively from being sold into slavery to them leaving slavery. We have no experience during that process of slavery, and when this film frames itself, as it so often does, as an allegory, as a mirror image of reality, we have to look at those elements. If you introduce the idea of human servitude and human slavery, you have to look into it just a little bit in your mouse form, and it doesn't. It jumps over it, and it has those just narrative issues that just do not work well. Oh, another idea. I'm sorry, I forgot to turn my notifications off on my film, so there are occasionally some dings coming through the film, so you will hear some dings as I'm going along, which ain't ideal, but from my perspective I can then just pretend I've had an idea, but it does mean that I've then got to think of something else. Anyway, the place where I was that I was on about how the narrative just doesn't flow too much, and actually we could have had a lot more focus on other places. If you keep, for example, if you keep the main stage song, if you keep that heart-wrenching piece and get rid of all the other songs, you probably free up about 20 minutes of filmmaking. Now let's take about 5 minutes of those films to do what the musical sequences did. Let's pretend that. So you got 15 minutes to play with if you still want to keep it at an 18-minute film. With those 15 minutes, you could have very easily explored his slavery in a very quick, very concise manner. You could have explored the family trying to cope with the passing of Fievel, his sister, because we know she's struggling with it, but we never really get much of an in-depth look at that. We could explore other characters, so get rid of a couple of the side characters, get rid of the pigeon, tone down the use of the good cat, and focus on the mouse friend that he meets during slavery. I can't remember his name for the life of me, because after he helps Fievel escape, it's basically a love story between him and another mouse. But because we haven't really had much of an exploration of the character, we don't really care that he's in a loving relationship with somebody else. So we could use that time to explore more and actually still keep it at 80 minutes. And I do think that musical sequences are often a waste on films so short. And so when looking at it from that perspective, there's a lot of just narrative misbeats, and I think it was more their commitment to focus on a true immigrant story that they actually left a few bits of important narrative pieces by the wayside in terms of how to connect this story together. It felt like a lot of set pieces, and occasionally it felt like sketches, and you had a very clear idea that the filmmakers had: we want Fievel to go through X, Y and Z, and then it's about how they achieve that. And from that perspective, it just did not work too much as a film. The animation still holds up today though. It's pretty fantastic animation. It's as you would expect from the period, and oddly the sort of mid-80s does have a very grunge look to its animation, and this film has that same sort of grungy appeal to it. You know, we've not yet got into the sharpness that we would have with the sort of Disney Renaissance era of filmmaking, where everything's much crisper, much lighter. We have brighter tomorrow to look forward to, which is rather fitting. So when it comes to an American tale, how would I rank it now? With the scope of full disclosure, this one was, the challenge was completed the 29th of the 9th, 20. So a good couple of weeks ago now. Now I'm trying to keep these coming as regular as 1 week as possible. I will be watching a film later today. This is the 18th when I'm filming this. And then I'll be getting my next one out sometime during the up and coming week, and trying to keep that sort of regular appearance, because I've started work the last couple of weeks and it's really taken a toll on my free time. I'm just managing to get my time back together, so I'll be able to do much more regular stuff. So that's where we'll be going forward. But in respect of this film, how would we rate it? How would I rank it? Well, I would say, for me, what would make me choose an animated film? Now, we have to go back to the fact that this film starring animals, that any kind of film where you got animals, you have to connect it to human experiences. There has to be anthropomorphic, because you have to find yourself within these characters. And I can't really think of any good film which doesn't anthropomorphize when you have animals starring it. And you have to have that spark of human identity, and this film has it through it like a stick of rock. It is incredible how recognisable experiences are, not just from the perspective of whether or not you're an immigrant, because I'm not, but there were so many sparks of identifying characteristics between various members of the Mousekevitzes, but wider afield. It really had that spark of human connection, which more, I think because I'm watching this for the first time as an adult, it's much more striking that it has that connection. However, there are issues, and those issues I've talked about, and they're largely speaking just from that narrative perspective, just from that use of time, that use of filmmaking, that I think that this film was a very noble, very well executed endeavour to tell a much needed story. But that attempt to tell such a wide-ranging story, such impactful story, had a negative impact on it as a film. But I've got to say, those people who said that this is too depressing for children, I do not agree. I do not agree. There is enough uplifting moments to basically put these children through, and I think the time limit of 1 hour and 20 may have been imposed for that, so you're not keeping children in gloom and despair for too long. And it is uplifting at the end, and you have to have that juxtaposition. If you're going to have such an uplifting ending, you're gonna need a few downs during the way, and I think it does that well. So for me, my final rating, because of the narrative inconsistencies, because of the narrative problems, because of a few timing issues in terms both of how you would string this film together, but also its use of time effectively, I would say I would be giving this 3.5 stars out of 5. And now, looking forward, the next challenge, challenge 5 that I'll be doing, is the early film of an actor or actress. So I've got to really be thinking of firstly, what I'm available, what I can find, but also what film of early actors or actresses I'm going to do. Now, it might be a case that I might pick really popular film actors or actresses like Meryl Streep, Jack Nicholson, and really find one of their early pieces and have a look at them. I know, for example, Kramer vs. Kramer is a film that I've always wanted to watch, so it might go from that perspective, or I might go from another. And then after that, challenge 6 would be a film with subtitles. And so we've got some very interesting viewing coming up, some much more unusual categories. So with that, I'm going to leave you there. I'm going to say thank you very much for anybody who is listening, and you'll hear from me next week with a early film of a famous actress or actress. Thank you.